Hello, everybody. Thank you to our over 280 participants joining us today for this expert roundtable on the role of the United Nations bodies in addressing global peace and security generally, as well as in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. My name is Yvonne Dutton, and I am a senior legal advisor at PILPG and a professor of law at the Indiana University Robert H. McKinney School of Law. I will be moderating today's discussion, and I am honored to be guiding the conversation with these experts. The Public International Law and Policy Group is a global pro bono law firm providing free legal assistance to parties involved in peace negotiations, post-conflict constitutions, and atrocity crimes prosecution. This roundtable is part of the PILPG's Thought Leadership Initiative. This initiative aims to share expertise and reflections from our work by organizing periodic roundtables that focus on prominent international law issues and pressing global conflicts. Today's expert roundtable is part of our Ukraine series, a series which aims to discuss recent developments in Russia's war against Ukraine, ponder complex legal questions related to those developments, and inform audiences of important international legal principles. As part of this series, PILPG holds expert roundtables every other Friday from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. This event is also supported by Weil, Gotshal & Manges, a global law firm which has provided legal services to the largest public companies, private equity firms, and financial institutions for more than 90 years. Weil is a long-standing PILPG pro bono partner, and they have supported a number of our projects, including PILPG's work in Ukraine. For today's expert roundtable, we will be discussing the role of the United Nations in international peace and security as it relates to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. As we are all aware, on February 24th, 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which has thus far led to thousands of civilian deaths and massive destruction of Ukrainian cities. In response to Russia's illegal actions and its contravention of core international legal principles, the international community has imposed fierce sanctions targeting every sector of the Russian economy. There has also been a swift response within the United Nations, which is the subject of our expert roundtable today. On February 28, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court opened an investigation into atrocities being committed in Ukraine without a referral from the UN Security Council. On March 16, the International Court of Justice ordered the immediate halt of Russian military operations. Meanwhile, on February 27, following Russia's veto 2 days earlier of a resolution condemning its invasion of Ukraine, the Security Council adopted a resolution calling for the 11th ever emergency special session of the General Assembly in accordance with the Uniting for Peace resolution. Thereafter, in March, many states took the UN General Assembly floor to condemn the Russian aggression and later to condemn the dire humanitarian crisis caused by Russia through the overwhelming passage of 2 resolutions. On April 7, the General Assembly voted to suspend Russia from the UN Human Rights Council. And on May 12, the UN Human Rights Council passed a resolution to set up an investigation into possible war crimes by Russian troops in the Kiev area and beyond. Despite all of these actions, numerous commentators have questioned whether the United Nations is effective in responding to aggression and armed conflict, and many have expressed a growing disillusionment with the UN Security Council's ability to safeguard international peace and security. During this event, our panelists will discuss recent developments surrounding Russia's war in Ukraine, provide insights to some of the most pressing legal questions regarding the role of the various United Nations bodies in addressing the Russian invasion, and provide background to the various international mechanisms charged with maintaining global peace, security, and justice. This roundtable will be 60 minutes long. Our distinguished panelists include former Ambassador Todd Buchwald, Professor Jennifer Trahan, Mr. Serhiy Dvornik, and Mr. Petro Burkowski. Today's event will be recorded and subsequently posted on our website. We ask that you please submit any questions you have for our speakers using the Q&A function, and we will do our best to answer your questions at the end of this event. Now, we are excited. I'm going to introduce our panelists. We're excited to welcome Todd Buchwald, former U.S. Ambassador for Global Criminal Justice. Prior to assuming that position, he served in a variety of capacities in the State Department, including during the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations as the Assistant Legal Advisor for United Nations Affairs and as the Assistant Legal Advisor for Political Military Affairs. Following his departure from the State Department, he served as a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, taught international law, international criminal law, and international organizations at the George Washington University Law School and various other law schools. And he was recently elected to be a member of the United Nations Committee Against Torture in Geneva. Professor Buchwald is also a Senior Peace Fellow at PILPG. Also joining us today is Professor Jennifer Trahan, clinical professor at New York University's Center for Global Affairs, where she directs the concentration in international law and human rights. She serves as one of the U.S. representatives to the Use of Force Committee of the International Law Association and holds various positions within the American branch of the International Law Association, including as co-chair of their Committee on the International Criminal Court. She has served on the Council of Advisors on the application of the Rome Statute to cyber warfare and is the convener of the Global Institute for the Prevention of Aggression. She has published scores of law review articles and book chapters related to atrocity crimes and international criminal law. She also participated in the negotiations of the ICC's crime of aggression. We are also honored to welcome Serhiy Dvornik, Acting Deputy Permanent Representative for the Ukraine Mission to the United Nations. Mr. Dvornik previously served the Ukraine Ministry of Foreign Affairs as First Secretary of the Directorate General for EU and the Political Directorate General, and also served as the head of the Political Analysis Unit from 2017 to 2020. Mr. Dvornik also served as a Secretariat of the Parliament of Ukraine, and he holds a Master's in State Management from the National Academy for Public Administration under the President of Ukraine. Finally, I am honored to welcome Petro Burkowski, Executive Director of the Democratic Initiatives Foundation, where he provides situational and strategic analysis of public opinion trends in Ukraine, analysis of foreign policy, as well as Ukrainian-Russian and Ukrainian-American relations. He has previously been the head of the Center for Advanced Russian Studies at the National Institute for Strategic Studies and served as a chief consultant for the Secretariat of the President of Ukraine. For full speaker biographies, please see the link sent in the Zoom chat, and you may also visit the PILPG website. Now, welcome panelists, and thank you for agreeing to participate in today's panel. I am going to turn to the questions now, and to begin, we are going to speak with Mr. Dvornik. Now, we're going to talk about some of the steps that the United Nations has or has not taken regarding the aggression and crimes perpetrated by Russia. But first, we would like to ask you, as acting deputy permanent representative for the Ukraine mission to the United Nations, what can you tell us about how diplomacy operates in the UN system within the current context? What should our audience know about the practical realities of international diplomacy during interstate conflict?
Thank you, Professor Dutton. Please stop me if I will be taking the floor for too long. And I would like to start with expressing my gratitude to the Public International Law and Policy Group for addressing what seems to be the most acute global security challenge and inviting me to share some consideration. While responding to your question, we have to acknowledge that the United Nations has not been designed to deal with conflicts with a holder of the Permanent Security Council seat as a party. Now look, Russia has launched its aggression 8 years ago, back in 2014. So it means that Security Council had enough time to take preventive measures to make the all-out invasion impossible. And what we have learned all these years is that prevention toolbox doesn't work in such a case. Even at the beginning of the year, when the Russian military buildup on our borders reached very dangerous levels and became a matter of primary concern for almost everyone, we had to persuade some council members that a Security Council meeting is needed, at least a meeting. And you might remember that on 23rd February, we again requested the Security Council meeting. It started at 9 p.m. as a preventive one under the provision of Article 6 of the UN Charter, Pacific Settlement of Disputes. And in the course of the meeting, Russian troops attacked Ukraine. So the focus was shifted to the Article 7, which is entitled Action with Respect to Threats to Peace and Breaches of the Peace and Acts of Aggression. You mentioned the draft resolution elaborated under this article, which was unsurprisingly vetoed by Russia in 2 days. And the Security, what does it mean? It means that the Security Council failed to exercise its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. And that's why Ukraine invoked the mechanism Uniting for Peace. So the issue of the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been transmitted under consideration of the General Assembly at its emergency special session. By the way, this is a mechanism which is used not very often, as the current session has been 11th only in the UN history. So up to now, you have already referred to the 3 GA resolutions that have been adopted in the course of March and April. And what can I say? That they have been adopted with very strong language, with clear definitions and qualifications of Russia's actions. And then they gain support of at least first 2 resolutions. They gain support of 141 and 140 member states accordingly. And that's about sentiments dominating now across the United Nations. So many have realized that the war in Europe is not something that you could ignore or watch from the sidelines. So it has cross-cutting consequences that hit almost the entire UN agenda. And these consequences are of very practical nature, for instance, in food security domain, because the looming food crisis would affect millions of people worldwide, especially in Africa and Asia. And therefore, the United States initiated 2 subsequent events this week: the ministerial meeting in the UN on Wednesday and Security Council open debate yesterday as a presidency of the Security Council in May. So, coming back to these resolutions, they are not legally binding, which is true. At the same time, already now, they serve as a guidance for the Secretariat and the entire UN system in terms of qualification and language. So whatever the UN engagement with this conflict will be, it will be a response to the Russian aggression. And we also proceed from understanding that these and future resolutions, they will serve as a point of reference for international jurisdiction organs, which is also very important. So now the Ukrainian diplomacy is working with member states to make it clear for them that their response to this war is not about taking sides of either Ukraine or Russia. It's about opting for the UN Charter and its principles, or for the fist law, for the aggression and insecurity for all. And once again, the scale of support of our initiatives in the General Assembly testifies that the vast majority shares the same perception, at least. So another important mission, as we see it, to help other nations to get rid of the false impression of Russia's almighty in the UN. Impression driven by its presence in the Security Council in the permanent seat. So it started in the Soviet times because the Soviet Union invested so much in this image, and so has done Russia. So what we are trying to do the same what the Ukrainian army does with the image of the Russian army on the battlefields. Another track, it's UN humanitarian engagement, because immediately after invasion, the Secretary General launched the flash appeal for Ukraine that calls for 2.25 billion to provide assistance and protection to nearly 9 million of Ukrainians. And for now, more than 1.3 billion have been received. They deliver aid, cash transfers to displaced people, and it's a very important job that we support and appreciate. We also encourage the Secretary General to continue using his good offices to the full. You know that in April, he visited Russia and Ukraine. And although Moscow demonstrated little willingness to de-escalate, it was possible at least to launch evacuation of civilians from Azovstal, Mariupol. And we appreciate this willingness of the Secretary General as well. He's willing to contribute to the resolution of the conflict. And it goes without saying that any resolution option should be based on restoring full respect to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized border. That's in a nutshell.
Thank you, Mr. Dvornak. Let me, you said a lot there, and I think we'll turn it to Professor Trahan now. And we'll sort of, build on some of what was said here. To provide some context, though, Professor Trahan, in this conversation about Russia's crimes and accountability efforts, can you sort of walk us through why Russia's invasion of Ukraine constitutes aggression and how the UN system can respond to the state's act of aggression? In particular, can the UN General Assembly or the UN Security Council take actions against Russia for its aggression, and why or why not? Now, this turns on some of the things that Serhii mentioned about the Russian veto. So I'm hoping that you'll talk about that and also maybe sort of weave in a little bit about how Russia became a member of the UN and the P5 with this veto power, if you would.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to be on this panel. Thank you to PILPG for hosting the panel. So we have had a very blatant violation of the UN Charter. The GA has condemned it in the strongest terms, condemned Russia's invasion as an act of aggression. Then if you turn to the definition of the crime of aggression, which is found in Article 8 bis of the International Criminal Court Statute, that means that political and military leaders who planned, prepared, initiated, or executed the crime have committed the crime of aggression. I think there is a lot more that the UN can do here. Just reflect that when we had Iraq invading Kuwait, the Security Council actually gave a force authorization to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait. Obviously, that's not possible here for two reasons, and it's already referred to that Russia, which somehow simply took over the Soviet seat on the Security Council. And I'll just say, unfortunately, and this has really been the case now for several decades. I think it would be very difficult to mount a challenge to that. I'm always interested in creative arguments. The charter actually still has the wrong China holding the seat as well. So we have two weird things in the charter in that respect. I know that was one of the questions, but that's been raised. But the Security Council is basically paralyzed now due to Russia's veto. Yes, there was one resolution that got out, but that body is going to have limited possibilities. I'm not suggesting a force authorization would have been the proper course here, because of course one is dealing with a nuclear weapons possessing state. But what can be done now is the UNGA could recommend a special tribunal for the crime of aggression based on an agreement negotiated between the UN and Ukraine. There has been a super clear violation of the charter that would qualify as a manifest charter violation under the definition. All those listening probably know by now that the International Criminal Court, while it has this definition in its statute, does not have jurisdiction in this situation. I actually think to pass by this moment and not have prosecution of this crime would be extraordinarily destabilizing for international security, and that it needs to be a multilateral response in order to have the weight that it needs to have. If this situation is not prosecuted, one might really wonder, well, what is the international community waiting for? And I think to let this opportunity go by could potentially embolden Russia even further, as well as others, such as China with aspirations on the South China Sea and Taiwan. Now, I know there have been lots of discussions of options for trying the crime of aggression in this ad hoc approach, which we must do because the International Criminal Court statute is too restrictive. And let me say, in the long run, the International Criminal Court statute needs to be fixed, so it is less restrictive. I convene a group called the Global Institute for the Prevention of Aggression, and members of our group had basically called for reopening what are kind of known as the Kampala negotiations, where the crime's jurisdictional reach was truncated. I think going forward, the crime needs to have broader jurisdiction so the International Criminal Court can prosecute this crime. So I am suggesting that we need a tribunal that would be negotiated between the UN and Ukraine. We have a good model of a statute in the Sierra Leone Special Court statute. Not every facet of the special court. The General Assembly could recommend the tribunal. It would not be creating the tribunal, but recommending it, as has been done for the Cambodia tribunal. Some features that one could envision would be an international roster of judges. I think this would have the most impartiality and legitimacy. It could sit in The Hague, which already houses a number of similar tribunals, and this could facilitate coordination with the International Criminal Court, which of course will be moving forward on war crimes cases. I mentioned the special court in particular due to size of the tribunal. It ultimately prosecuted 10 individuals, and there is really an inbuilt size limitation in Article 8 bis of the Rome Statute. Those who commit the crime of aggression in this definition are only those who are in a position effectively to exercise control over or to direct the political or military action of a state. So it is a fairly limited subset of high-level political or military leaders. So we're not talking a large tribunal. This is not a regional issue. It should not be endorsed by a regional tribunal. In the long arc of history, that will not be the most credible alternative. The most credible, the most forceful alternative will be the entire United Nations standing behind this. We have a definition. The definition in Article 8 bis of the Rome Statute should be utilized. All states were invited to join the negotiations when this definition was agreed on. I was in Princeton, part of these negotiations, and I remember the Russian delegate participating in the negotiations. Ultimately, the definition was adopted by consensus in 2010 in Kampala by all states parties to the International Criminal Court statute. So there is strong multilateral backing for this definition. Some of the details I'm suggesting will be forthcoming in a white paper that will be provided to those who are interested. So again, I'm not suggesting, when I say international roster of judges, I'm not suggesting creation of the Yugoslav and Rwanda tribunal, because those were very large tribunals. But I think David Crane always said a lean and mean court was what is envisioned by the Sierra Leone Special Court. I will conclude by simply reinforcing this is really an historic opportunity to get this right. This is an issue that all states have an interest in supporting because it's really about the sanctity of borders and whether you want the UN Charter enforced. And we simply can't get enforcement of the UN Charter against a permanent member through the UN system. I have ideas for challenging that. We maybe have time to discuss those later. So I strongly recommend this be a multilaterally endorsed approach. And I think many states have an interest in securing the sanctity of their borders. And we have a precedent for doing this, basically the Sierra Leone Special Court statute with a few modifications. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Trahan. Before I pose some questions to our other panelists, I do want to turn back to Mr. Dvornik and provide him with an opportunity to speak to some of the things that Professor Trahan said. Professor Trahan shared some thoughts on accountability mechanisms and how the UN may play a role in furthering these accountability mechanisms. We would love to hear from Mr. Dvornik of your thoughts on priorities that Ukraine has for using or employing the United Nations to help address Russia's aggression and pursue accountability for that aggression. If you could share some of your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Professor Dutton. Look, let's start again with a very interesting issue, the role of Russia in the P5. If I may add something too. It's interesting that while opening the UN Charter, we do not find any reference to Russia as a permanent member of the UN. So, frankly speaking, Russia has occupied his seats as it occupied the territories. Yet, indeed, in December 1991, Russia addressed the UN and informed of its intention to ensure continuity of the Soviet membership in the UN. But this request was not duly considered, neither by the Security Council nor by the General Assembly, as it should have been done under the Article 4 of the Charter. So, it's unprecedented that a country effectively imposed its membership in the UN by its unilateral decision. That's how it looks like. And we do not think that we should turn a blind eye to this, despite 30 years have passed. Therefore, we raise this issue and we continue to do it. With regard to accountability, well, again, I refer to the Ukrainian Army Corps, Ukrainian Army, as their final goal is to restore our sovereignty and territorial integrity on the ground. Restoring justice is the final goal for the Ukrainian diplomacy. And we could speak on both political accountability and legal accountability. Russians are violators of the UN Charter, and their actions undermine the very foundation of the UN. So they must bear the burden of this unprovoked war of choice. And therefore, their capacities to affect the activities of the UN organs and agencies should be limited. So, suspension of Russian rights of membership in the Human Rights Council that you have mentioned is just one of the examples. We challenge Russian presence and applications for other bodies as well. For instance, in April, Russia was not elected to the Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues, for the first time in the history, by the way. Instead of a representative of the Crimean Tatar people was elected, from Ukraine, of course. Russia, just recently, Russia also failed to be re-elected to Committee on Non-Governmental Organization, UNICEF Executive Board, UN Women Executive Board. So it's just the beginning. That's how we understand Russia's political responsibility and the work of limiting Russia's presence in the UN bodies, which is now underway. Legal responsibility. Well, maybe the next time I will bring our legal experts to elaborate in detail. But it goes without saying that during the aggression, the Russian armed forces have committed and continue to commit multiple war crimes against the civilian population, as well as crimes against humanity. Thousands of civilians were killed, including children. That sounds very personal for me, by the way, because now I live in New York as a member of the Ukrainian mission to the UN. But in Ukraine, I live in the small village of Warsaw, which is a part of the city of Bucha, whom almost everyone knows now due to very sad reasons. And almost all of us here have a lot of personal stories from the ground, from Ukraine. Therefore, we do our best to bring all cases of violations of provision of international humanitarian law by Russia to the respective international bodies. As you may know, Ukraine has initiated, you know it because you have already mentioned it, that Ukraine has initiated legal international proceedings and at bringing perpetrators of those crimes to justice. In particular, such proceedings are unfolding in the International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court, and the European Court of Human Rights. We initiated a case in the International Court of Justice against Russia already on February 26th, just 2 days after Russia launched its full-scale invasion. And you know that the court ordered Russia to immediately suspend military operations. And what Russia shows, as always, Russia shows complete disregard. So we draw attention of the other UN membership that every signatory of the UN Charter should demand binding orders to be implemented. International Criminal Court and Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine are actively engaged to combat impunity. But there is a question who will be brought to accountability for the crime of aggression. And Professor Tran has already referred to this issue. That's why Ukraine has endorsed a proposal by a leading specialist in international criminal law to create a special criminal tribunal for the punishment of the crime of aggression against Ukraine. And such a tribunal would complement the work of the International Criminal Court in investigation and as necessary prosecuting persons responsible for the planning, preparation, initiation, and execution of the act of aggression. We in the UN, as a mission, have to ensure political support to this idea. To this end, in March, a cross-regional group of states, notably Albania, Colombia, Denmark, the Marshall Islands, the Netherlands, and Ukraine, established the Group of Friends of Accountability following the aggression against Ukraine. This is an informal forum aiming at information sharing among states, among international organizations, institutions, civil society, in order to optimize the process of accountability and the delivery of justice. For the time being, about 50 member states have already joined this group. So I believe that this group of friends will be able to complement the existing international proceedings on various war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Russia by discovering and mapping new accountability processes and evidence collection initiatives. So we are going to initiate events, we are going to initiate some sort of documents within the United Nations, and we will ensure that political support to the process of bringing Russia to responsibility for its crimes. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn this to Professor Buchwald, but we noted that Mr. Dvornak just mentioned a number of international bodies, such as the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. And we've talked about the fact that the International Criminal Court has opened an investigation, and we have talked a little bit already about the International Court of Justice decision. Wondering from a legal perspective, Professor Buchwald, if you could comment on sort of the roles of these two bodies, the significance of the actions that they have taken as it relates to the UN's role in addressing peace and security, and as that relates especially, of course, to the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Thank you, Yvonne, for the question. And first, let me join the others in thanking you and thanking PILPG for organizing this event. It's timely, it's important for people to understand these issues, and I'm thankful to have been asked to participate in it. What you say is exactly right. The steps taken by both the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and the International Court of Justice are important, significant ones. Insofar as the ICC is concerned, as Uri was talking about a little bit, the prosecutor announced in February that he would seek formal authorization to begin a formal investigation of the atrocities being committed in Ukraine. So neither Ukraine nor Russia is a party to the Rome Statute, which is the treaty that created the ICC, but Ukraine had submitted a formal declaration accepting the court's jurisdiction under a special provision contained in paragraph 3 of Article 12 of the Rome Statute that serves as a special basis for ICC jurisdiction. We then saw an extraordinary outpouring of support for the investigation. I believe eventually, I think the number was 43 states formally joined the referral of the matter to the court. And the referral was significant for two reasons, at least two reasons. First, as a legal matter, the prosecutor could now commence his investigation immediately without having to await formal authorization from the ICC judges. Second, as a political matter, it was an extraordinary demonstration of political support. 43 countries joined the referral, including a huge swath of the closest friends and allies of the United States. And just to put that number 43 in context for you, it is by far, by orders of magnitude, the largest number of countries that have ever joined the referral. Indeed, there is only one referral ever that's involved more than one country. So I think it's fair to say that the level of support for the prosecutor's action here is unprecedented. Why is the prosecutor's action important? Well, first, the rules under the Rome Statute clearly allow the prosecutor to pursue charges regarding any of the atrocity crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide that occur on Ukrainian territory. And this is regardless of whether the perpetrators are from states that, like Russia, are not parties to the Rome Statute. And it's clear that it includes all territory within Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. So any Russian claims to have recognized the independence of portions in the East, notwithstanding. And this will be something hard for the Russians simply to ignore. Second, this is important because it at least points a path towards accountability for perpetrators of heinous acts. The ICC prosecutor, I believe earlier this week, announced he was sending a team of 42 investigators and forensic experts and others to Ukraine, which is the largest ever single field deployment by the Office of the Prosecutor. And the existence of this kind of energized investigation can inject at least a measure of some doubt into the minds of individuals, potential perpetrators, that may encourage them to reconsider some of what they're doing or empower them to resist and create sort of dissension within the ranks. A commander might well think twice about his personal liability if he commits war crimes if he thinks he may up as a chance of ending up in the in jail. And then third, the fact that the ICC prosecutor is engaging in this effort can create a greater appetite for justice generally, give momentum to the effort, complement its spur efforts in Ukraine to pursue justice, which are in fact proceeding well under the direction of the prosecutor general. Create more political space for other states to carry out prosecutions in their national courts, and help isolate and tarnish those involved in the crimes, those accused of the crimes, even if they never see the inside of an ICC courtroom. So for all those reasons, I think the ICC action so far is extremely important. On the ICJ side, which Sergei also mentioned, the Ukrainians were very shrewd the way they went about this. They brought a case to the court under the Genocide Convention. Under the Genocide Convention, the court has jurisdictions over disputes between parties to the convention. Ukraine and Russia are both parties to any dispute about the interpretation or application of the convention. And what the Ukrainians basically said is, we have a dispute under the convention, and our dispute is that the Russians are wrongfully claiming that we Ukrainians have engaged in genocide, and that this is the basis for their invasion under international law. And the Ukrainian team, which by the way included my former boss, Harold Koh, with whom I worked closely on ICJ cases when we were in the State Department together. They then also said, and while you are figuring out the merits of this issue, which will take a while because of the way the ICJ operates, but in the meantime, we ask you to order interim measures, which is sort of, for an American audience, akin to a preliminary injunction or a temporary restraining order. So while the case is pending, don't let matters get worse while the case is pending before the court. And that's what the court did by an overwhelming vote of 13-2. And it said that in the interim, which includes now, immediately, Russia is under an international legal obligation to suspend its military operations. Admittedly, the Russians have refused to comply, but this decision, I think, is still an important building block in rallying support for the international organization and embodying its rejection and revulsion about the aggression that has taken place.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, I do want to turn to Mr. Bukovsky, and I want to talk about another one of the UN bodies that Mr. Dvornik also mentioned, which is the United Nations Human Rights Council. And the United Nations Human Rights Council just last week on May 12th passed a resolution to establish a commission of inquiry to investigate possible Russian war crimes in Ukraine. And now Russia was also suspended from the council the prior month. And I would like to know, Mr. Bukovsky, if you could comment on the impact that any of these actions has had or you think will have in addressing Russia's aggression and the crimes being committed in Ukraine. For example, what do you view as the impact of the fact that Russia was suspended or that there's this commission of inquiry? And maybe do you have any suggestions for how the UN Human Rights Council might improve its response to the situation in Ukraine?
Thank you, Professor Dutton. I think I'm the only person not with the legal background among you. I'm a political scientist and a social researcher. So maybe I will not speak on behalf of the legal expertise, but if you allow me just express certain ideas. First, about the decision about the commission of inquiry, how it can be improved, we have to bear in mind that as Mr. Dvornik pointed out earlier, that the invasion started not on February 24th, 2022, but it started in 2014. And there is still a debate on what date it started, when the Russian special forces occupied the administrative building of the local council in the Crimea, or when Russian president actually issued a secret order to start this operation. And as we've seen in case of current second full-scale invasion, this order could have been issued months before. It can also be the December 2013. And so it's very important, because if we speak about the legal proceedings and about persecution, we need to find that it was not a coincidence, that it was a purposeful action, and the highest Russian authorities are involved in this, and that it should be not only personal responsibility, but also the responsibility of the Russian state, because Vladimir Putin represents not himself, he represents the Russian state. Second, so therefore, if we speak about the improvement, how it can be improved, maybe the commission of inquiry should, while beginning to examine and look into the crimes committed after February 24, 2022, we need to go back and to look what Russians have done in Crimea and in the occupied territories on Donbass and in the other regions where their special forces had been operating. Secondly, even if this commission would start working, there is a great question mark whether they will be able to come to the occupied territories of Ukraine, which are occupied by Russia right now. And for me, it's not a question mark, but it's clear that they will not be able. Russia has not allowed to come for the OSCE mission to occupied Crimea. They restricted OSCE mission in the occupied territories of Donbass, and I don't think that they will allow anybody to come and to examine and to investigate. And the second point is that let's imagine that Russians suddenly they saying that let's have a ceasefire. Let's have a ceasefire and talks about the peace. So is it the end of the work for the Commission of Inquiry? Then we have to think about the decision, maybe not the same, but very close to what have done about the Middle East and about the Palestine. That this commission should be without time frame, without time framing, but should be extended indefinitely until all the crimes are investigated and all the evidence is collected. It should not be limited by the time frame or the ceasefire. Excuse me, wait a minute.
Thank you. I am going to turn it briefly back to Professor Trahan, just to sort of talk about the UN Security Council a little bit more, because we have talked all a little bit about Russia being a member of the P5 and having the veto power. Are there any ideas you might be able to share for us in ways in which the Security Council could be altered or strengthened to better safeguard international peace and security, especially as it pertains to this veto power and the Russian aggression in Ukraine?
Great, thanks, Yvonne. Well, I did put in the chat the title of my book, which goes into these issues. And it's nigh impossible to amend the UN Charter, right? So the P5 have basically veto on charter amendments. So you're actually not going to get rid of the veto power. There are initiatives to voluntarily restrain it, and we only have the UK and France endorsing those. And they commit, they won't use the veto in the face of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. The American Bar Association has now come out and asked the US to join that, although the US has not done so. I am not optimistic that we will get all the P5 to agree to this. So I think voluntary measures may have gone as far as they can go. Liechtenstein got a very important resolution passed with a large number of co-sponsoring states. And I was happy to see the US surprisingly as a co-sponsor, that every veto there will at least be mandatory GA discussion. My book goes a step further and says there are actual legal problems when assumed genocide is occurring and the Security Council has a resolution trying to stop or curtail the commission of genocide, and that gets vetoed. You're actually enabling the genocide. So a situation like that, my book looks at it from three legal levels. Genocide is at the use level of jus cogens. It's what our highest level of the law. Now, how is it that something in the UN Charter, the veto powers in the UN Charter, how is that read above our highest level of law? Like, there is a disconnect going on there. The veto should not be used to basically enable further jus cogens violations. Enabling jus cogens violations would be void as a principle of international law. We cannot have the veto used this way. You also find in the charter itself, there are limitations for how the veto is supposed to be used, because the charter is framed by certain purposes and principles. And these include respecting international law. If you're vetoing your own condemnation for aggression, are you actually respecting international law? No, our veto power is being used in a way that is not corresponding with the remainder of the obligations in the UN Charter. And a third level you could look at it is the veto used in a way that is consistent with obligations under the Genocide Convention, the obligation to prevent genocide. Under the Geneva Conventions, there's an obligation to ensure respect for Geneva Convention provisions. Well, if you have a veto in the face of genocide or war crimes, you're not honoring these obligations. Crimes against humanity don't yet have a freestanding treaty. The draft has an obligation to prevent in it. If that is passed, that would be a treaty source for the obligation to prevent crimes against humanity. But I believe this also exists as a matter of customary international law. My book didn't go as far as to examine aggression and the veto, but it's the next area I hope to be writing on, because I find a tremendous hypocrisy in violating all of the other provisions of the Charter and being unable to use the veto to protect your violation of the remainder of the Charter. The veto is not above all law. The veto sits in the context of the other obligations of the UN Charter. It sits in the context of an international system of law, and these challenges need to be put. The GA could ask a legal question to the ICJ on the legality of veto use while there's ongoing genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. And the GA should put that question to the ICJ, because we're having the veto used in a way we see it particularly in Syria, with Russia's 16 vetoes, many of them joined by China, basically enabling chemical weapons attacks. Everything the international community wanted to do to try to prevent chemical weapons attacks was blocked by the veto. That is not consonant with obligations under international law, and the state of affairs needs to be challenged. Can't amend the veto, so I'm suggesting go to an outside body, go to the ICJ for some of these challenges. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Trahan. I'm going to turn it to Mr. Bukovsky again, and I just want to talk a little bit, in our remaining time, we've spoken about some of the limits to international bodies. We were just speaking about that, the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council. To complement the efforts of UN bodies, just wanted to talk to you briefly about what do you see as Ukraine's unique role in itself, in helping to address the accountability for the Russian aggression and the crimes being committed in Ukraine? Do you have any comments on how Ukraine might or should interact with various UN bodies to further its own efforts on the ground at seeking justice for crimes being committed in Ukraine?
As far as I understand, the concept of use covenants that was mentioned by the Professor Trahan is that these norms should have no derogation. And while Russia is showing that it's not the case, and while we are speaking about the universal or regional organizations, is that we are based on a presumption that someday we will see a new Russia or another Russia, which will follow the international law and which will return back to the, let's say, family of the civilized nation. And or we need to have some new types of organizations, both universal and regional, that will include norms that explicitly exclude any kind of political regimes like Russia or other authoritarian regimes, and will not allow them to enter unless they change. From this point of view, I think that Ukraine cannot influence the international community, but the Ukrainian example is showing what can happen to the international law and international order if it means that we need to have some balance between democracies and authoritarian regimes. So as far as both types of regimes are included into the international organizations, or if the same kind of international law is applied to them, or if they exist in the same system of international law, it means that the wars will continue, and even the nuclear war can happen and will happen in this case. So Ukraine, what Ukraine is addressing is that such types of countries, we shouldn't wait until they will change, but we should make this change by the very severe instruments like sanctions, and sometimes by force not invading these countries, but in self-defense or in a very strong preventive measures. Any other types of the instruments could not help to restore the international law or to make authoritarian regimes respect the human rights, because human rights, the concept of human rights is not something that is comprehended or respected.
Thank you. We have time just for one question, which I know we could spend all day on, actually, but I'm going to turn it over to Professor Buchwald and say, any final thoughts as to what the international community can do to ensure that the UN and its various bodies can better respond to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and to prevent such an action from occurring again in the future?
Sorry. Thanks, Juan. Yes, let me just make a small comment about that. I would go back to what Sergey said early on, which is the idea of the veto making Russia invincible is an illusion, right? So there's the veto, and it's not ideal in this situation, obviously. But if you sort of think about what's the main thing that's happening now, and the main thing that has to happen is the defense of Ukraine, right? It's a military conflict. And the Security Council was never really set up to deal with that kind of situation, as Sergey points out. There are organizations that were meant to, at least from the US point of view, to deal with those kind of situations, like NATO. It's a different part of the international architecture, and it's there. And if you think about what was vetoed didn't include any kind of authorization to use force anyway. It was just a condemnation. But in any case, there's no need for an authorization to use force. The charter deals with this issue through Article 51 and through the collective right of self-defense, which is enabled from the US perspective, which the US operationalizes through NATO. So it's not one of these questions where the exercise of the veto is preventing the main thing that needs to be done from happening. It is happening. And people can quarrel with that the NATO countries aren't doing enough, that they should be directly military involved, but it's not because of a lack of authorization. It's because of a policy decision of, the extent to which we're willing to risk escalating the conflict. And I think in general, in a more broad sense, I think what happens is if in the international system, which has many parts, the UN has many parts. The UN has a human rights mechanisms, it has security mechanisms, it has humanitarian mechanisms. And it has the General Assembly, it has the Security Council. And if one part of it is put in a situation where it can't do the work that needs to be done, the international community finds other ways to do it. So NATO, the Security Council is not going to step into a situation like this. NATO can step into a situation like this. The Security Council is being stymied. Lo and behold, we have a new General Assembly resolution dealing with these kinds of situations. So I think, I get back, it's to underscore Sergey's point that the existence of this veto should not be made to give the appearance that the international community is without the tools necessary to sort of deal with this crisis.
Excellent. That is all that we have time for today. And I thank all of you, the audience, for joining us. And I thank all of our panelists also for all of their excellent contributions to the discussion that we had today in this webinar. The recording will be available on the PILPG website, and it will be shared with anyone who has registered for the event. The event was part of the PILPG Thought Leadership Ukraine series. Thank you very much. This event was supported also by our pro bono partner, Weil, Gotchel and Manges. And to follow along with the Ukraine series, please join us for our next event on June 3rd, where our expert panelists that day will discuss war crimes as it relates to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You can then join us on June 17th, where our expert panelists will discuss territorial integrity in the context of the Russian invasion. Thank you very much.